Hi, boys and girls. Uh, Today my book reading will be based on a request from a certain someone who actually loved Mr. Greedy. However, today I decided to choose another character from the Mr. book, which is, are you ready? Mr. Grumpy. Look at him. Are you always grumpy? Alright, let's see what Mr. Grumpy is about. It was a lovely summer evening. Mr. Grumpy was at home, Crosspatch Cottage. He sat down in an armchair and picked up a book. And then, do you know what he did? Can you guess what he did? He tore out all the pages out of it. Every one of the pages. Look at that. Mr. Grumpy can't stand books. He has a shocking bad temper. In fact, he's quite the most bad-tempered person you can imagine. Grumpy by name and even more grumpy by nature. The following morning, he was out in his garden pulling up flowers. He couldn't stand pretty flowers growing in his garden. When out of the corner of his eye, he saw a figure. How does someone don't like flowers? They are so beautiful. It was Mr. Happy. Mr. Happy came by. Good morning, said Mr. Happy. Good, said Mr. Grumpy. What's good about it? But, said Mr. Happy, but nothing, went on Mr. Grumpy. Get out of my garden. I beg your pardon, said Mr. Happy. You heard me, snapped Mr. Grumpy. Go away. I say, laughed Mr. Happy, you are a bad-tempered fellow. Grunted Mr. Grumpy. And, went on Mr. Happy, bad-tempered fellows need to change their ways. Rubbish, retorted Mr. Grumpy and went into his cottage, deliberately stepping on Mr. Happy's foot as he passed him. Ouch, said Mr. Happy. Bang went the door of Crosspatch Cottage as Mr. Grumpy slammed it behind him. Mr. Happy stood there, looking not quite so happy as he normally does. His foot hurt. He thought and thought and thought some more. Then he had an idea. He smiled and went to see Mr. Tickle. I wonder what Mr. Tickle can do to change Mr. Grumpy. Mr. Happy told Mr. Tickle of his idea on how to get Mr. Grumpy to change his ways. And Mr. Tickle grinned the sort of grin that goes from ear to ear. That is, if you have ears, which he doesn't. He doesn't have ears. So does Mr. Happy. They don't have ears. Oh, he grinned, rubbing the hands at the end of those extraordinarily long arms of his together. That sounds fun! That afternoon, Mr. Grumpy went to town, shopping. He walked into Mr. Meat's shop. Mr. Meat was a butcher. Give me some sausages, snapped Mr. Grumpy, and be quick about it. Poor Mr. Meat, who was frightened of Mr. Grumpy, did as he was told. But, as he was doing as he was told, something appeared through his shop doorway. Do you know what it was? Can you see? What appeared at the doorway? Can you spot it? Look. Whose hand is that? It was an extraordinarily long arm belonging to... Well, you can guess who it belonged to, can't you? That extraordinarily long arm of Mr. Tickle came in through the door and across the shop and up to Mr. Grumpy and tickled him. "Oh!" squeaked Mr. Grumpy in alarm, dropping his sausages and looking around to see what had happened. But could he see anything? He could not. Mr. Grumpy could not see what was happening. Grunted Mr. Grumpy and picked up his sausages and went next door to the cake shop. Crash went the door of the shop. "Give me a cake," snapped Mr. Grumpy, "and hurry up." Poor Mrs. Fairy, who sold cakes, was frightened of Mr. Grumpy, so did as she was told. But as she was doing as she was told, guess what happened? "Oh!" squeaked Mr. Grumpy, dropping his cake and his sausages. He just could not understand what was happening. And all afternoon, Mr. Grumpy kept being tickled and dropping his shopping and picking it up and being tickled and dropping his shopping and picking it up and being tickled and dropping his shopping, and he just could not understand it. Any of you can guess what's happening? On his way home to Crosspatch Cottage, he met Mr. Happy again. "Hello," grinned Mr. Happy. "Having a nice day?" "Get out of my way," snapped Mr. Grumpy, "before I kick you." But almost before the words had passed his lips, that extraordinarily long arm of Mr. Tickles had appeared from behind a tree and tickled him yet again. He jumped in the air and dropped all his shopping yet again and fell over. Mr. Happy looked down at Mr. Grumpy lying amid a jumble of sausages and cake and newspapers and sweets and milk and cornflakes. "I think," he laughed, "that if you were to change your ways and be not quite so bad-tempered quite so often, this sort of thing might not happen to you quite so often." Grunted Mr. Grumpy. He picked up all his shopping yet again and went home to Crosspatch Cottage. But on his way, he did think about what Mr. Happy had said, because he very definitely did not like what had happened to him that afternoon. Mr. Happy and Mr. Tickle laughed and shook hands. And so after that, he did try to be not quite so bad-tempered quite so often. And the more he tried, the less he found he was tickled. And so he tried more and more. And these days, he's quite a changed person. Why? Only the other evening, he picked up a book, and do you know what? Can you guess what? Did he tear out all the pages of the book? He only tore out one page. That's an improvement. So boys and girls, do you think it's nice that someone is grumpy all the time? I don't like a grumpy person all the time. I mean, we can feel grumpy at certain times, it's alright. But, we have to calm down, right? And nobody really likes to be around grumpy people. So don't be grumpy, or Mr. Tickle will come and tickle you. Well, I hope that you liked this book reading, Mr. Grumpy. I certainly like reading it. So, till the next time, bye.